This is the story of a war fought out on the streets of our cities. It is a story about the vicious Yardie criminals who deal crack and murder on our streets, and about the informants the police use to catch them. It is a story in which a multiple murderer escaped prosecution, and in which a lethally dangerous gunman was allowed to stay illegally in this country where he raped and murdered. It is a story about the line between right and wrong, and about the disastrous results of law officers straying across it.
The story begins in the late 1980s, when Scotland Yard realised that they were facing a new threat. Jamaican gangsters known as Yardies were moving into London, pumping huge quantities of crack cocaine onto the streets and using violence in a routine, almost casual way, shooting and kidnapping and torturing those who stood in their way. And unlike the more familiar mafias, the Yardies had no formal structure, which made it much more difficult to find out what they were doing. It was a new problem, but Scotland Yard fell back on an old solution: informers.
The first wave of officers who confronted the Yardies understood the dangers of trying to use them as informers.
Well, it's necessary to use informants to deal with most kinds of crime, and it always has been so. I mean, informants go back thousands of years, I guess.
Former Superintendent John Jones won a reputation in the 1980s as one of the Met's best Yardie hunters.
Informants have always been used by the police, dealing with all kinds of crime. In the case of the Jamaicans, the Jamaican criminals that is, they are from a different culture by and large from the culture which we live in here. And therefore it's much more difficult for the police to, if you like, infiltrate in a more general way the community which they hide amongst.
The people that you're trying to catch are nasty, and sometimes the people and the methods indeed that you have to use to catch them are nasty.
As head of serious crime in Nottingham, Peter Coles knew at first hand the dirty world of the informant.
It should always be the police who are in control of the informants. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for the informant to actually be in control of the police officer.
The use of informants to fight the violence of the Yardie gangs may have been understandable, but a number of episodes over the last 3 years suggest that Scotland Yard's informant-based anti-Yardie operation has been seriously and repeatedly compromised. At the centre of this story of chaos were 2 men who had never been trained for this work and who were allowed to operate with the minimum of supervision. One was an immigration officer, Brian Fotheringham. Fotheringham had no specialised training and few resources. The other was an ordinary police constable named Steve Barker, who'd been pounding the beat in South London. Barker had stumbled into the war against the Yardies when he persuaded one key man to become his informer. Suddenly, he was moved to the front line, to Scotland Yard's intelligence department, SO11. Barker and Fotheringham fought the Yardies on the streets of London. They sorted out the moral and legal tangles as they went along. Trouble was not far away. One of P.C. Barker's informants was Delroy Denton, known on the streets as Epsy. Denton arrived in this country illegally in 1993 and was recruited as an informant after being arrested in a raid on a Brixton pub. He worked for Scotland Yard for 2 years, providing information on other Jamaican criminals. But after 2 years, Denton was jailed for life for the murder of 24-year-old Marcia Laws. Marcia's sister Mercy is now looking after her 2 young children, Cassius and Malika.
They're babies still. Cassius is 3.5, Malika's 27 months. And so they don't really know too much about Marcia, but, you know, they know her. Through talking about her, showing them pictures, things like that. And with all this happening, Cassius is picked up on certain things, and he's realised that, you know, something's happened to his mum. The other day, he asked me, you know, why has she gone to heaven? And I said, oh, because she just died. And he said, no, the man beat her up.
Well, I think we all feel really very angry because we know it shouldn't have happened in the first place. We know that it shouldn't have been in the country. It just shouldn't have happened in the first place. You know, obviously we're really angry because it could have been prevented.
Denton's information may have been valuable in the fight against the Yardies, but giving him his freedom as an informer had a terrible price. What sort of a man was this? Law enforcement officials relied on him for information, yet he could murder the mother of 2 small children. Down at Central Police Station in Kingston, Jamaica, Delroy Denton is well known. Two officers from the Jamaican Constabulary dug out his criminal file from their records department.
I know him as a gunman. I know him as a hardened gunman. And he's very witty. Very witty. He's what I will call a silent killer. He will creep upon you at any moment, kill you, and no one knows.
When we told Sergeant Thompson that Scotland Yard had recruited Denton as an informer, he stressed the need for Denton's handlers to control him.
It will be very important because, as I said before, he has a wide knowledge of what is going on, but he's a person you cannot take him too lightly. You will have to have somebody else keeping an eye on him.
In May 1994, in London, Brian Fotheringham found himself sitting across the interview table from Delroy Denton, who had been arrested with a knife in a drugs raid on a Brixton pub. Brian Fotheringham knew a lot about his interviewee from police intelligence files. The illegal immigrant was a founder of a Jamaican Yardie posse and had fought in street wars there. His record in Kingston included a 16-year sentence for firearms offences and armed robbery. Denton was a very dangerous individual, Fotheringham noted on the file, and he underlined the word very. He filled in another document, an exceptional risk form. This was to alert Scotland Yard to the presence of this dangerous man. It described him as being of an extremely violent nature. Fotheringham considered Denton so dangerous that when the Jamaican applied for political asylum here, Fotheringham was certain that he should stay behind bars while the application was handled. Long-term detention was required. Then an odd thing happened. Brian Fotheringham had a conversation with Constable Steve Barker from the Yardie unit at SO11. And Fotheringham changed his mind. Denton no longer seemed to be dangerous. Fotheringham noted, PC Barker has stated intelligence has shown the subject has not been involved in any serious criminal matters since being here. After consulting a more senior immigration officer, Fotheringham concluded there was no realistic chance of detaining Denton for long. Denton could be released after all, while his asylum claim was handled. But there was one thing Brian Fotheringham did not record in his notes.
That day, Delroy Denton had agreed to work as an informer, both for Fotheringham and for Steve Barker. And that night, this very dangerous individual was allowed to walk out of custody and back onto the streets of London.
Some of Denton's closest associates were none too pleased to see him. They knew he was deeply disturbed. They had heard him boasting about the girl he had throttled in a phone box, and about another woman whose throat he had cut. And now he was free again.
A lot of the sort of police officers who identify themselves as being good at handling informants tend to be fairly young and inexperienced because they're full of enthusiasm. They're actually out on the street. They're dealing with the sorts of crimes which lead them to be able to build up a bank, if you like, of informants. But they haven't necessarily got the kind of wisdom which is very, very vital in one's dealings with an informant. They probably don't always understand as they should how dangerous these people are. And sometimes the vision of what they may obtain from the informant blinds them to the dangers which they're putting themselves and sometimes other people in.